Dr. Susanne Reichert is an archaeologist and a Feodor Lynen Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt-foundation at the University of Michigan. Since 2009, she has been actively involved in field works in Mongolia and has co-led surveys and excavations in Karakorum, the first imperial capital of the Mongol Empire. The Global Asia Initiative of Duke University is pleased to invite Dr. Reichert to talk about her recent books. One is entitled A Layered History of Karakorum, Stratigraphy and Periodization in the City Center, and the other is entitled Production in the Mongol Empire, Karakorum and its Artisans. I am Yuan Julian Chen, Environmental Humanities Fellow of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Center and the Global Asia Initiative. Dr. Reichert, welcome to our platform. You have conducted an extensive field survey at the archaeological site of Karakorum in Mongolia. Karakorum holds a very important place in world history as it was the first imperial capital of the Mongol Empire. But I bet most people in the States haven't really heard about the city before. So I wonder, do you mind to first give us a brief introduction of the founding of the Mongol Empire and where is Karakorum as a region in the Mongol Empire?
The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in world history, and it was founded by a Mongol leader called Temujin, who was born in the 12th century in the Mongolian steppes. He was later called Chinggis Khan, which probably most would have heard about. What they did was there were different tribal factions in what we call today Mongolia. In the late 12th century, there were internal strifes. But finally, Temujin achieved to collect all these bands into a cohesive polity. And in 1206, he was raised as the great Khan of all these Mongolian factions. And from there on, they conquered vast territories in Central Asia, Western Asia, what is today Russia, and to the east to the Japanese Sea, and under the successors of Genghis Khan, even all of what we call today China. So Genghis Khan, he died in 1227. He was succeeded by his son Ögedei Khan. And under Ögedei Khan, the city of Karakorum was actually built under the succeeding emperors after Genghis Khan. The whole empire was not really divided, but was parted into 4 different realms, so to speak, that were governed in the first place by sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, but under the leadership of Ögedei Khan. And in the following years, these at one point cohesive realms split up and formed 4 distinct dominions, which is the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Yuan Empire or Yuan dynasty in what is China, founded under Kublai Khan in 1270 and following years, and the Ilkhanate. So these 4 different dominions took very different trajectories. And I'm mostly concerned with the Yuan Empire that also governed what is Mongolia. And I'm mostly concerned with Mongolian archaeology. And the Yuan governed until 1368, the Chinese realm, and then they were expelled by the following dynasty from China, and they rallied back to Mongolia, were now called the Northern Yuan, and continued to govern. The ecology of the Mongolian steppes, it's based on a very continental climate. So we have very severe winters, which are very, very cold, and short summers that are very, very hot. And the seasons in between only very short, and most of the time you have a very dry climate. Karakorum was founded probably by Genghis Khan, or this is what the sources tell us. This might be a later invention to legitimize this construction of the capital. But we have a source from the first half of the 14th century, which says that Chinggis Khan decided to have a camp or maybe even residence in this spot, which is in central Mongolia in the Orkhon Valley. The city itself was only built afterwards by his successors. Orkhon Valley is within Mongolia a comparatively fertile area. We have with the Orkhon a perennial water body that supplied fresh water throughout the year. The hills are wooded and it's rich in other resources that you would need to build a capital or a city.
Was Karakorum the capital of the Mongol Empire, or it was the capital of the Yuan dynasty as one of the four regions?
From its existence, and first building activities are testified for 1235 under the Great Khan Ögedei until 1260, the capital of the overall empire. In 1260, Kublai Khan, he developed first Shangdu and then later Dadu, which are both in modern China, and he referred the capital status from Karakorum to his new center of the Yuan Empire that he then only founded. This political shift is due to different reasons, probably due to logistics, because Karakorum is far off in the northern steppes with relation to this whole body of China, which was finally conquered in 1276, also under Kublai Khan. So it was much more convenient to have the capital more closer to the whole body of his territory. Nonetheless, Karakorum kept very distinct importance. Even at that time, even without the capital status as such, there were still investments being done in the city. So it did not automatically die only because it wasn't the capital of the Mongol Empire anymore. It also became the capital of the province Lingbei, which was founded in 1307. So it also had a distinct provincial capital status after some time.
What happened to the city when the Mongols retreated to the steppe and became the northern Yuan? Did they make Karakorum the new capital again, or they chose a different location?
We don't have that many sources about that time, but what we do know is that they went to Karakorum and they also continued using that city. But we see that even after 1368, the city of Karakorum was lived in. There were craftspeople working there, and it consistently was lived in until the early decades of the 15th century. So maybe 50 to 60 years after the Northern Yuan came to Karakorum. We even have a seal of Ayushidara, the Yuan prince that was then in 1371 in Karakorum, and we have a seal with his imprint within the middle of Karakorum in the settlement layers. So they used the city, they continued to do administrative work in the city. What happened afterwards, we don't really know. What we know for sure is a monastery was built on top of what we suppose was the former palace area of Karakorum. So this is what you see when you go today to Karakorum, which is the modern city that is directly close by to Karakorum. You see this immense white walls with a Buddhist monastery inside, which is still in active use. This is at a zoo, which was built on top of the former palace in the late 16th century. As for the erection of this Buddhist monastery, building materials from Karakorum were used. So at that point, Karakorum probably didn't exist anymore as a living city.
You did such an extensive survey at the site of Karakorum, and I wonder what's your methodology of your survey? How did you measure the size of the city? How did you identify the infrastructure and the structure of the city?
So our research in Karakorum has a long history. So Bonn University has been working in Karakorum since 1999. In the beginning, we started off with excavations, but then we thought we don't understand the city very good if we only concentrate a comparatively tiny area. So we decided we need a new map of the complete city, and the complete city entails not only the walled area, but we already saw from satellite data that the city expanded outside this actual wall. So what we first did was a magnetic survey together with our colleagues from the Leibniz Institute for Photonic Technologies, and they use a ultra-fast magnetic survey technique that is pulled by a vehicle. So it's very fast and can get a lot of data in a very small amount of time. We have a complete map of Karakorum and its outside, and the way that they fix up this magnetic machine, it also gathers topographic data through a differential GPS unit attached to the card. So we gathered alongside not only magnetic, but also topographical data. So we have two different information which we can play against. Sometimes structures are seen in the topography, but not in the magnetics. And sometimes magnetics gives us a better information about the different kinds of structures. For example, the main streets in Karakorum were around the middle of the 13th century built with stone slabs. And we can see that in the magnetics pretty clearly.
I see.
Or the kilns. There are more kilns not yet excavated in Karakorum we see in the magnetic data. And they are often attached to these larger compounds that we think are probably either religious buildings or palaces, which is indicated by the glazed roof tiles we find on top of the platforms that the foundation for the buildings. We find these glazed roof tiles only with very high elite buildings, so with religious or with aristocratic buildings. So this gives us clear information. And what we did then was also a pedestrian surveys around Karakorum to better understand the immediate vicinity of the city. So this is a contiguous survey we did, very systematic and with a full coverage. So we also understand how far the city stretched beyond the structures that we identified in the topography and in the magnetic surveys. And we saw the 4 kilometers beyond Karakorum, the whole area is strewn with shirt scatters. And these shirt scatters from the Mongol period, they tell us that there were probably temporary campsites, maybe military or others that used the vicinities for camps. And this tells us of a high activity within not only Karakorum, but also in a radius of 5 kilometers around it. So at some high seasons, this valley buzzed with activity, and we can only assume that when the great Khan then moved on to a different residence, that the population declined again, and then only the core population remained in the city center.
I see. This is fascinating. So with all those surveys, you and your team at Bonn University, you're able to produce a much more comprehensive and much higher resolution map of Karakorum, right?
Yeah, we did. And you know, the methodologies, they keep on developing. So now our partners with the magnetic instruments, they continue on developing their instruments. And we also use remote sensing techniques with drones to gather more detailed photos, aerial photography, and the drones also continuously keep on developing. So within the near future, we will even have better quality and other quality imagery of the city, and we will keep on seeing new structures, and we will keep on seeing better data, so we can produce even better maps and understand the city even better.
That's fascinating. I want to go back a little bit and ask you about the rationale of building the city. You mentioned the political reasons, but it's very natural for people to wonder, why did the Mongols want to build a city on the steppe? The city is a settled way of life, but the Mongols, they're a nomadic people. So when they built the city, were they actually considering abandoning their nomadic way of life and change to a settled life? Or it was maybe because they've seen other cities, they want to emulate it? What was the reason?
The reasons for building a city for the Mongols was mostly political, I would say. So there's this Chinese saying that Yulu Shutsai was supposed to say to Egede Khan that you can conquer an empire on horseback, but you cannot govern it from horseback. So building a city was a sort of necessity for administrative reasons, and this was probably the main impetus for the Mongols to build a city, and they built it in the steppes because this is their home country, this is where they come from, and this is their core area. As to this conception or this concept that it's like a paradox that nomads build cities, there have been cities before in the steppe, but they are always in relation to these empire foundations. So the very first tiny baby steps towards what we might call a city were already done under the shogun around the turn of the era. So they had square walled enclosures that don't evince any more building activities inside, but these are fixed architecture in the landscape, probably, or what we hypothesize were used for gathering people together for maybe political assemblies. And these are already fixed places. And also the shogun had small settlements, also fixed settlements, also doing agriculture, farming millet. And then later on, you have the Uyghur Empire. And the capital of the Uyghur Empire, Khar Balgas, or Odubalik it's called, is also located in the Orkhon Valley, only 30 kilometers north of Karakorum. So this entire region had very high political significance already at that point. And there were earlier cities in the environment. So it's not a completely unknown concept to the nomads. They engaged daily with the surroundings, so they saw the relics of Khar Balgas. They sort of knew that cities existed. They just didn't need it that for their political economy until they founded the empire, and then they built a city in the same region, only 30 kilometers to the south. And the question of whether they gave up on their nomadic life, no, they did not. So when we talk about the population of Karakorum, it's not as if the pastoralists that made up the population of Mongolia were going into the city now and were living in the city. No, the city population was made up of people that were attracted because of its trade opportunities, for administration, scribes and such, and military, and also deported populations gathered in the conquered territories and taken to Karakorum to perform craft production, for example, for the great Hans. So its population did not consist of the Mongolian pastoralists themselves.
I see.
This is also the reason why these cities did not continue to live after these empires failed, because without the empire, there was no rationale for the city anymore. So it's no urbanized population as such.
I see. Do we have any idea or any rough figure about the population size in the city of Karakorum?
Yeah, this is a tough question. We have one comparison that was made by William of Ruppruk, a Franciscan monk who visited Karakorum in 1254, and he stayed in the city for like 2 or 3 months. And he compared Karakorum to Saint-Denis, which is the European case of reference that he had. And he said, Saint-Denis is so much better and larger than Karakorum. And then if we take Saint-Denis at that time, in the 13th century, there is such a thing as a Comte de Feu for Saint-Denis from 1327. So it's a bit later, but okay. And this Comte de Feu is like a numbering of all the households of Saint-Denis. And from that number, we might suggest that Karakorum had like a population of 7,000 to 12,000 people when Rupruk was there. But we have to also keep in mind that the population of Karakorum was probably highly fluctuating. So it was not as if the great Khans, with their complete retinue of thousands of people, was all the time staying in their capital. No, they were on a political route of different residences that they visited throughout the Orkhon Valley and in neighboring regions, and they just wandered from one residence to the other throughout the year. So they didn't stay all the time in Karakorum. So when William of Rupruk visited Karakorum, the Khan was actually there. So there will be more people there than at other times throughout the year.
Right.
So this number gives us a rough idea, probably around 10,000 people, but we have no means to really know if this was the number throughout the whole year or even at different points of time, because the city, it existed for 200 years. And William of Rupruk only gives us a static glimpse of 1254. So we don't know what it was like 100 years later.
I totally get what you said. So the nomadic people before the Mongols, such as the Khitan and the Jurchen, they also had this practice of moving around throughout the season. The Khitan call this Nabo, and I think they usually go to the northern capitals in the summer and go back to the southern capitals in the winter. So it sounds like it's a very prevalent nomadic tradition, such as what's happening in Karakorum. And the example you gave on how to estimate the population of Karakorum through the comparison of William of Rupruk, this is a very interesting way of thinking about the population. You mentioned that many of them came here for trade. So I guess there are like merchants, there are like soldiers, and you also mentioned like officials assigned here for duties. Were those people mostly Mongols, or were there also Chinese, Muslims, or Europeans?
They were mixed. They came from all over. They were from China. We have primary sources, the Yuanqi, for example, the official history of the Yuan dynasty, that tells us of military colonies in Karakorum that probably were coming from China. We have Central Asian Muslim merchants described by William of Rupruk. We have Europeans, also craftspeople that were deported from Hungary to Karakorum that are being talked about. So we have a mix of different ethnic origins living in Karakorum. And also Rashid ad-Din, a Persian source, tells us that Egede wanted the nobles of the Mongol Empire to build their palaces nearby his own palace at Karakorum. So there were also probably very refined palaces within Karakorum aside from the Khan's palace. But those aristocrats, they also were not living all the time at Karakorum. They only gathered there for specific assemblies when the great Khan was there.
I see. So you mentioned the palaces. So I wonder, what were the building material of the palaces and also the building materials for the city itself? Was it very different from the cities in agrarian societies, or they were about the same? And in either case, where did these building materials come from? Were they from local or they were from far away?
So the building materials were not essentially different to any other city built in Central Asia or China. And also the people that probably did the actual work of building, they came from China, they came from Central Asia. These were the builders that were collected and transferred to there to do the work, but with a specific Mongolian plan in mind, so to speak. But the actual materials were the same. It's mud brick bricks, also hired brickworks made of clay, wood, for example. We see like a development within Karakorum. So from the earliest stage of building, we must imagine that it was like a very pioneering era where there weren't that many fixed houses, but only wooden sheds where the builders were probably living, who did the work to build first the palace, a Buddhist temple, the surrounding wall, and then only then went on to build the residential areas for themselves. Because then in later settlement layers, we have also brick buildings for the craftspeople living in Karakorum, and the housing became better and better. And the materials, they were fired in kilns, and we have them in Karakorum itself, sometimes attached to the grand architecture they were supposed to supply. So, for example, we have this Buddhist temple excavated by the German Archaeological Institute together with the Mongolian Academy of Sciences. And they also have a line of kilns directly attached to this building, which was used to fire the bricks and the roof tiles for this grand architecture. And then there were outer facilities outside of Karakorum. Also a massive battery of kilns, 14 different kilns near the Orkhon River, also used for firing building decorations used in Karakorum. And they are outlying settlements like Bagnarinam, which is on the western side of the Orkhon, and where also there were kilns for firing building materials. So you have lots of evidence for how the city was built, in which kinds of manners and which architectural styles, which is very similar to those styles in China and Central Asia also for the first 30 or 40 years of Karakorum. And we know that the wood, for example, used to build these houses, the timber came from the surrounding hills of Karakorum. We know that from dendrochronological data of nearly 200 samples taken in the city center from these buildings, and gives us a good impression that all these building materials were gathered within or even were produced within Karakorum or within the vicinity of Karakorum.
And what was the most popular timber species or tree species used in the construction?
Larch. Siberian larch is the most widely evidenced, and it's also so far the only wood that we have identified which was being burned for heating purposes. We only have few analyses for that, but we do have 97% larch has been used, and then a little bit of juniper.
You just mentioned the existence of Buddhist temples in Karakorum. I wonder, from your survey on the site, did you see the traces of other kinds of religious buildings in Karakorum or around Karakorum?
Yes, so there have been excavations in two spots of Karakorum that detected religious buildings. So it's the famous temple of the Rising Yuan in the southwest of Karakorum. And then there's a building in the northern part of the city, which is probably also has been used for religious purposes. And the excavators, also the German Archaeological Institute, think it was an Nestorian temple for the Church of the East. From the new city map that we produce from magnetic and topographic survey of the whole of Karakorum, there are some ground plans that are very symmetrical in the layout. And this symmetry in the layout suggests they were religious buildings. We don't know for sure until we do some excavations, but alone from the layout, it's highly suggestive. Again, William of Rupert, who is our best source on Karakorum,
Yes.
he tells us that there were 16 temples in Karakorum. And he was pretty accurate in his descriptions from what we can gather from the archaeological material from our surveys and excavations so far. So there will be more religious buildings to come in the next decades.
I wonder, what is the most impressive urban structure you have found in Karakorum?
What is the most impressive are the excavations in the city center, where we have 4 to 5 meters depth of settlement cultural layers on top of one another. And there we have several phases of houses built, a house collapsed, another house was built on top. And these housings were used by craftspeople. And they were different materials. There were people working with glass, making beads and ornaments. There were blacksmiths, there were fine smithies working with silver and gold. There were bone carvers, people working with mineral stones to make ornaments and also beads. And this tells us a lot about the everyday life of the people actually living in Karakorum.
I see. Very interesting. I want to ask you a question that you mentioned in your paper, and I find it very fascinating. You have made a specific distinction between the word urbanism and the word urbanization. This is very illuminating for me, but I wonder if you can give the audience a general introduction about this distinction and what does it mean for the case of Karakorum.
Right. So from the observation that these cities in the Mongolian steppes were intermittent and transient and only popped up in relation with these empire foundations, we thought more about what that means in relation to urbanism and urbanization. So urbanism for us is the existence of cities. We do have cities, but what does it mean in relation to urbanization, which is for us a more sustainable, urbanized society that continues to live in cities and also founds cities out of their own impetus. For the Mongolian steppes, we don't see this kind of urbanized society really. So after these empires fail, and this is not only the Mongol Empire, but also previous empires, these cities are left, they go to waste. The people that lived in these cities didn't continue the city life. And also the pastoralists living around these cities, they didn't go to live in these cities, and they didn't continue this culture of being in a city. This is the distinction that we make, which helps us to understand why they built these cities and why these cities discontinued alongside the empires.
This is a very illuminating point, and I really appreciate you explaining that. Let me ask you the last question for today. How did the building of Karakorum, a very unusual settlement on the steppe, how did that change the ecology, or how did that affect the ecology of the steppe?
There are some geological cores that have been drilled in to the north in Uginur, which lies about 70 kilometers to the north of Karakorum. And also there have been some corings in the upper Orkhon Valley, not so far from Karakorum. And both these drillings show in their pollen data and macrobotanical remains a huge human impact or huge human activity within the valley during the Mongol Empire. But the resolution of this data is not fine enough to give us more information concerning, for example, deforestation or deterioration of the environmental capacities of this region. But we are planning on doing more work on that, and we hope to get a grant to address exactly these questions.
Okay, Thank you so much, Dr. Reichert. Thank you for this wonderful introduction of the fascinating city of Karakorum, the Mongolian steppe. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.